Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here. Today we're going to take a look at a game of Siegbert Tarrasch's. So the famous great German grandmaster who lived from, I think it's 1862 to 1934. One of the best known teachers of the era, certainly, and a player renowned, somewhat unfortunately, but I think somewhat justifiably, as a dogmatist. So let's discuss that. I want to say a little bit about the man and his career, and also mention his writing a little bit, and then discuss the issue of dogmatism, and then finally we'll take a look at one of his games. Okay, so Tarrasch, of course, as I said, was an early grandmaster, and definitely a great player, one of the best players in the world for, easily a couple of decades or so. In the early 1890s, he was definitely a contender to be the world champion. Of course, back then, it wasn't just a matter of having an elite status. You had to actually secure a match. And for a variety of reasons, he never really got around to it until it was really too late. By the time Lasker became champion and was champion for a few years, he was definitely better than Tarrasch. And when they finally played a match, I think in around 1908, I might be wrong about that, so don't sue me. But when they did play the match, Lasker won very convincingly. I think it was 8-3 with 5 draws, something like that. Really very one-sided. But as I said, in the early days of Tarrasch's career, he was definitely a world championship contender. He was a medical doctor, if I remember correctly, so that took up quite a bit of his time, and so that perhaps prevented him from pursuing a match with Steinitz in the early 1890s. And and then he had some, he really didn't get along very well with Lasker, and that made it harder for him to get a match with him. And as I said, by the time they finally did play a match, it was definitely too late. But anyway, Tarrasch was a great player, an important theoretician as well. He, I don't know if he invented the systems, but certainly they're reasonably named after him, and even the open Ruy Lopez could be named for him as well. Okay, now, the issue of him being a dogmatist. So Tarrasch is famous for this, and this is in part from his writings, or in large part because of his writings, where he makes some really bold pronouncements, some really, over-the-top, dogmatic, let's say it, pronouncements. One book in particular that I've spent some time looking through the last couple of days is his famous book, 300 Chess Games. All games by him played up through 1894, whether it was wins, losses, basically all of his games, or all of his serious games up to that point. And it's a very good book, a very interesting book. He was definitely one of the best annotators of the period. Both, I would say, because he's providing some serious analysis from time to time, but also the annotations are very instructive. Nevertheless, you find some really remarkable statements about various openings. So I want to show you some of them. Okay, so first of all, the open Ruy Lopez, which could be named after him, justifiably. So of this he says, this is the best defense. Okay, so no bishop to e7 here, but just this is the best defense. Statement made rather straightforwardly. Okay, d4, d5, c4. About this position and the next few options, Tarrasch has some very bold things to say. About d takes c4, he writes, accepting the queen's gambit only makes sense only if one intends to maintain the gambit pawn. This is generally known not to be the case, maintaining the pawn, and therefore I consider taking the pawn to be a strategic error. If both players had already played the e-pawn, amounting to the changing of the move order, the game might have started as follows: d4, d5, e3, e6, c4, and in this position, no good player would capture the pawn. More clear yet is if 1 e4, e5, 2 d3, d6, f4. Let me put that on the board. So let's say e4, e5, d3, d6, f4. Okay, so about this, he says, clearly e takes f4 is bad. The mistake lies in the fact that black, instead of answering the attacking and developing move c4, back here again, with the defending and developing move, for example e6, he simply cedes his central strength and even loses a move. as black makes a move which neither improves his position nor speeds up his development, and ironically, white uses the tempo to accelerate his own development. Okay, well that's, the interesting thing is that it sounds actually fairly reasonable, but there are a number of points that should be made. Okay, so first of all, let's say e3, e6, c4. Well, it might be true that black won't necessarily play d takes c4 here, but that's not because d takes c4 gives black an inferior position. Rather, it's that white has really foreclosed his options pretty severely with the move to e3. So here, for instance, okay, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6. Well, now white plays bishop to g5, but that's of course impossible through this move order. So now there's no reason why black needs to take on c4. The reason why people play the accepted variation is that they want to deal with this bishop on c8. So you can play the Slav, but that has its drawbacks. If you play c6 here on move 2, then one of black's traditional freeing moves in queen's gambits, which is c5, is no longer available, or at least if it comes at the loss of a tempo later on. So, there's a bit of a concession there. If you play e6, the standard move, or the standard queen's gambit decline move, well, then this bishop on c8 becomes a bit of a hassle. How do you free this guy up? So the point of playing the accepted, the queen's gambit accepted, is that in many lines this bishop on c8 has no trouble finding its way to a good square. That's the point. Now, in the Tarrasch defense, which is what he's going to advocate, which we'll come to in a moment, black often has no problem getting the bishop on c8 into play either. However, there are some difficulties with this, but let me say a little bit more before we come back to that. So back to knight to c3. He says about knight f6, he gives us a question mark. And he says, on this move, white always gets the better game. The only correct defense is c5, which he almost always gives an exclamation point to. So let's discuss this a little bit. So c5. Let me see if I have this somewhere else. No, okay, so c5. C takes d5, e takes d5, knight f3, knight c6. Now, in 1894 when he wrote this, I'm not sure that this g3 plan was all that popular. So you would have these kind of traditional isolated pawn positions. Let's take a look at a position like e3, knight f6, let's say bishop to e2, and here black can play a number of things. He can play bishop d6, a6, c takes d4. All right, let's say c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop to d6, castles and castles. Well, here black has a very free game. Both of his bishops are going to participate quite nicely, and he has some kingside attacking prospects in exchange for the slight positional weakness of the isolated pawn. However, since these days, white has started playing g3, so this plan has been attributed variously to Schlechter and Rubinstein in particular. And after knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, castles. Very often, the white d-pawn and the black c-pawn are exchanged, and white hopes to slowly but surely exploit the weak pawn on d5, and also to achieve some kind of blockade on the squares d4 and c5. And white has had good results with this kind of plan over the years, and it's taken a lot of the fun out of the Tarrasch. So it's not at all to go the opposite direction and say that the Tarrasch is refuted. That's definitely not true either. But it it has its difficulties too. I mean, there's no free lunch here for black with a Tarrasch defense. So either way, or whether black plays e6 on move 3, plays the Slav, goes for the Tarrasch, whatever, in all of these cases, white has reasonable chances for an edge. Okay, so that's a little bit of his dogmatism, well, first with the open Ruy Lopez, and now in the Queen's Gambits. Another amusing bit of Tarrasch dogmatism here. After e4, c5, knight f3, e6, knight c3. There's a game he played against Paulsen, which went knight to e7, and we reached kind of a typical Paulsen/Taimanov position here. This is game 112 in 300 chess games. But I just like his comment about knight to e7 here. He calls this a slithery, sickly move, which is pretty funny. And I think those of us who have maybe had some difficulties facing the Paulsen/Taimanov/Kahn over the years might might find a little bit of amusement and maybe empathy with this. Okay, well now let's look at the French, which is another opening that Tarrasch has made some serious contributions to. So e4, e6, d4, d5. Okay, well what should white do here? We'll come back to e5, since this is the move we're going to look at in our main game shortly. About knight to c3, if bishop to b4, well he gives this move a question mark in game 85 of that book. He also gives d takes e4 a question mark, which means that he thinks, of course, the only decent move here is knight f6. Of course, all three of these moves are completely playable, but it's interesting to see these harsh judgments. If knight to d2, well, once again, Tarrasch has his own way here. Knight f6, he gives a question mark too. Of course, knight to d2 is known as the Tarrasch variation. If c5, e takes d5, well, queen takes d5 also merits a question mark from good old Siegbert. So the only move that he approves of naturally is e takes d5. Again, taking an isolated pawn approach, analogously to the Tarrasch variation in the Queen's Gambit. So, lots of Tarrasch openings here. Well, what about e5? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that he thinks this is kind of a stinker too. And the game we're going to take a look at here is his game with Louis Paulsen from Nuremberg in 1888. It's a very good game, very nicely played game, and it's the kind of game that justifies, or at least seems to justify, the dogmatic statements that he makes. So e5, he gives a question mark, and he says, this is unfavorable. The attacking system, Paulsen's brainchild, finds its ultimate definitive refutation in this game. Well, this will no doubt come as a big surprise to many world-class players who play this system with white. But nevertheless, we'll see certainly some fine play on Tarrasch's part, and fine play that at least illustrates why this can be a dangerous setup for white if he's playing someone who knows what he's doing, if he himself isn't very well prepared too. So the game continues. c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6. All of this is still absolutely mainline stuff. And here Paulsen plays bishop to d3, which is a known line. Tarrasch's comment here. Too late it becomes clear that the bishop should go to e2. This tempo, because the bishop goes back to e2 a few moves later, this tempo makes black's attack easy. The mere fact that the king's bishop cannot occupy its natural square is in itself a refutation of the opening. In other words, the bishop belongs on d3, but it can't be sustained there because of pressure against the d-pawn. So white is already in trouble. In fact, this is a gross overstatement. White does perfectly well here with bishop to e2. So black has no problems. I mean, I think the theoretical reputation for black's position is quite good here, but it's still very playable for white as well. And the main line is a3, and here the battle continues theoretically, and black can choose between the blocking move c4, which tries to exploit the weakened b3 square, and more open approaches with, for example, knight to h6, followed by c takes d4 and knight f5, with play rather like what we're going to see in our main game. So, of course, it's not so bad, but anyway, we'll see that Tarrasch's play certainly makes a good case for the black position. Now, here he notes that if bishop to d7, then d takes c5 is strong. And in fact, this is an approach that Nimzowitsch popularized years later. It's quite good, and it certainly shows that Tarrasch was no slouch, and could think in rather dynamic ways too. So, dc, bishop c5 castles, and white has these blockading plans with b4 and trying to occupy d4 and c5 later on. Okay, so c takes d4 is played by Tarrasch, and this is correct. cd, bishop to d7, and now the threats to win the d-pawn. Of course, I trust all of you realize that knight takes d4 is terrible here. Knight d4, queen d4, and then the standard tactical trick with bishop to b5, which is check, and which discovers an attack from the white queen on black's and wins the queen. So that's why, of course, you can't take the pawn right away, but after bishop to d7, bishop to b5 won't be checked, so now it is a threat. Well, here Tarrasch mentions just two moves. The move in the game, which is bishop to e2, and also notes bishop to c2, which he doesn't think so much of because of knight to b4, which forces the trade of the bishop. And this is correct. I mean, this is a position that would be taken nowadays as well. Note that the attempt to save the bishop with bishop to b3 is bad because of bishop to b5, preventing castling and introducing the idea of knight to d3 check. But a move that is interesting and has become relevant since then is this gambit line with kingside castles. Now, after knight takes d4, white has a choice. The traditional approach is knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and now either knight to c3 or queen to e2. Black has done pretty well in these positions after this immediate capture. But knight b to d2 has actually scored pretty well for white. And I would say this position, I don't know if it's resolved yet, but again, certainly white has done quite well here after either knight to c6 or knight to e7 or bishop c5. Really, all the positions black has done, or all the black alternatives, white has a good score. So this seems to at least be a viable approach for white as well, at least an interesting one. So once again, Tarrasch is far too quick in making such, again, just unequivocal pronouncements that e5 is just bad and that this the system receives its ultimate definitive refutation and so on. Okay, well, bishop to e2, though, as played by Paulsen, here it does seem that black is doing quite well. And all right, while certainly we can't say that black is winning, black might be better already, and certainly has no problems. So, as for bishop to e2, if e5 led by force to a position like this, then we could absolutely say that e5 would not be a very promising system. But as we've seen, white has at least three pretty reasonable alternatives between e5 and the present position. Okay, well, let's continue. Here black can play either knight to h6, with the idea of bringing the knight to f5, which would be similar to the game, but it also gives the option of maybe flicking in bishop to b4 check first, and only then playing knight to f5. One point of this is that after knight g to e7, here white has the option, which wasn't, I think, known at Tarrasch's time, of playing knight to a3, and then swinging the knight to c2, where it helps not only defend the pawn on d4, but to at least give a little bit of a fight for the b4 square. So for instance, knight f5, knight c2, and then here black can choose between a lot of moves. There's bishop to e7, which is an idea we'll discuss later on in the game. Bishop to b4 check, where are we? We're here. h5 to preserve the knight on f5, and knight to b4, another idea, to exchange off one of the defenders of d4, and finally even rook to c8, just kind of keeping all the options in hand before making a decision about what to do with the bishop on f8. So all of these moves are possible here. So knight a3 is an option. Knight to c3 is perhaps not so fantastic, although it's playable. Knight f5, knight a4, queen a5 check, and really there's nothing better than knight to c3. Black certainly has very good play here. Okay, so the move chosen by Paulsen is b3, and this perhaps isn't so fantastic either. I would prefer one of the two moves that I just mentioned. So knight f5, bishop to b2, bishop to b4 check. Now, the knight interpositions both lose the d-pawn. Bishop to c3 does as well. We just trade bishops and then take on d4. So white is forced to play king f1. And now black has a decent choice. There's again h5, but while this isn't bad, in fact this was played by no less a player than Rubinstein himself against Nimzovich in Carlsbad in 1911. The game was eventually drawn. Just give a few moves here. And black ended up playing bishop to e7 anyway. So anyway, black was okay. Good hard fight, eventually drawn. But Tarrasch plays bishop to e7. And he likes this because he thinks that this also preserves the knight's future. It's because now if white plays g4, the knight can go to h4. But it doesn't weaken black's kingside position. He can castle without worrying about creating a target with his pawn on h5. So it's an interesting way of thinking about it, and I like this point. So he says that h5 would weaken the castle position to a considerable extent. Okay, that part's debatable, but he continues, and offer white counter chances to compensate for his queenside weakness. And that comment, I think, is rather instructive, because when you have an advantage in some part of the board, in some area, or some factor that's in your favor that's like a material advantage. I think in general it's right to try to keep the position such that all the advantages are on your side. Even if it's just one advantage, better to have one advantage against none than perhaps to create a position where maybe you've enhanced your advantage a little bit, but you're giving your opponent some counterplay. So this idea, if there's just one weakness that your opponent has, if you can just keep it about that and not give your opponent anything to kind of chew on for his own entertainment, then that's often a good idea to do so. So that's what bishop to e7 is about. Okay, Paulsen plays g3 to help himself castle by hand, and a5. And Tarrasch, interestingly, mildly criticizes this move, but then plays it again some years later. I think he believes that rook to c8 immediately would be a better choice. And I'm not sure about that. I think a5 is actually fairly decent. He doesn't like it because after a4, white gets the b5 square, but the b3 square, or the b3 point becomes a weakness for white. That said, so really this is, again, a battle of the ideas that we just mentioned, where I just suggested, well, Tarrasch was certainly suggesting that if you have one weakness, or sorry, if your opponent has a weakness, you don't want to create counter weaknesses to give him some counterplay. And a5, a4 does just that, so it weakens white further, but it gives white a little bit of a trump as well. So you have to kind of decide. I think that b5 is not really such a trump that black can really overwhelm white's potential hold over a b5. But you can just decide. All right, sometimes you also have to decide whether the one weakness that your opponent has is really enough. Sometimes you may have to push a little bit further. As Fisher says, sometimes you got to give squares to get squares. So there's no simple answer. I would say that if your opponent has a serious weakness, if your one advantage, or if your advantages are very serious and you think they're enough to win by themselves, then I would say avoid giving your opponent counterplay if possible. If the opponent's weaknesses are fairly small and you definitely need to do something further to have, let's say, good winning chances, then okay, you still have to be very judicious about it, but it's worth considering in that case creating potential weaknesses in your camp if it means also creating further weaknesses for your opponent. All right, well, this bit of philosophizing aside, let's continue with the game. So a5, a4 was inserted, and now rook to c8. And here, Paulsen played bishop to b5, jumping right into that weakened b5 square. All right, here Tarrasch played knight to b4, which isn't bad, but I think a pretty reasonable pair of alternatives were the immediate f6. This is not bad. Or let's say castling first, and after a move like king to g2, now playing f6. So black is trying to break down white's center and also create some pressure against f2. I mean, you can see, for example, some kind of variation with like f takes e5, knight e5, knight e5, de5, and then this knight moves somewhere maybe to h4, and then there's queen f2 check. Okay, when the white king is in plenty of trouble, and of course the bishop on b2 is hanging as well. So lots of entertaining possibilities there with this. And if white tries to, let's say, get some kind of hammerlock on the e5 square, something like takes, 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 and takes, and knight e5, well, after rook c to f8, it's far from clear that white is really going to be happy with the results. There are, again, all kinds of nasty possibilities involving the f2 square, and it should be noted that white can't play f4 to neutralize the file because of knight to e3 check. Okay, so I just point this out as an alternative plan that's quite interesting. It doesn't just have to be about black's queenside pressure and about the potentially weak pawn on d4. All right, well, Tarrasch played knight to b4 here. And interestingly, Tarrasch now writes that knight to c3 is better than the move played in the game, which was bishop takes d7 check. Okay, now from here, Tarrasch mentions only the possibility bishop takes b5, knight takes b5, and says that white has some reasonable prospects here. And I think this again goes along with his criticism of a5 a few moves ago. He notes that knight to c2 is a mistake for black, although it looks very good. It hits the rook and it threatens knight to e3 check, but after rook c1, white gets way too much material for the queen. or if not way too much, at least too much. So he's got a rook and 2 knights for a queen and a pawn, which is a material advantage. Well, small material advantage, but clearly if you look at the activity of the pieces, there's no comparison. Black's queen has just nothing to do, and the bishop is passive. Moves like bishop to a3 are coming, even if black castles here, it's still coming, and then maybe knight to d6. Even if not knight to d6, there's just a big clamp. Maybe bishop to c5 first. Really an awful position for black. It's just losing here. But while that's all very well and good, black has some options here. One option is bishop to c6, and here I think black is slightly better. So this keeps the b5 square under control. So white has a superfluous piece, as Dvoretsky would put it. Both the bishop and the knight would love to control the b5 square, or to occupy it. The bishop to c6 prevents him from getting either to have, prevents him from, let's say, doing so. So if black makes this exchange, bishop b5, knight b5, well, now white has no extra pieces. So there's just one piece, and it's taking advantage of the b5 square. Bishop c6, on the other hand, prevents this from being the case. And if white exchanges now, well, b takes c6, takes care of that possibility from the white knight. Okay. Now the irony here is that Tarrasch went for this again. So despite criticizing a5, he actually played this in a game many years later in San Sebastian in 1912 against Nimzowitsch. He played knight a6, hoping to evict the bishop. So I guess he had forgotten what he had written in 1894 about the game from 1888. Anyway, the game continued king to g2, knight c7, and here Nimzowitsch played bishop to e2 and went on to win the game, although I'm not sure he's really any better here. Certainly he's doing fine, but I don't know if he's better yet. Probably he should have played bishop takes d7 and then g4, followed by bishop to a3. And the black king is a little bit awkward. For instance, if bishop to e7, then takes, and rook c1, and white is definitely a bit better here. Not much, but a little bit. Anyway, this is all interesting, but again, the remedy for knight to c3 is neither bishop takes b5 check, nor knight to a6, but bishop to c6. All right. Anyway, there are a number of moves that black could have reasonably varied with earlier. Anyway, in the game, instead of knight to c3, back to our main game here, Paulsen played bishop takes d7 check, king takes d7, knight to c3. Here, Tarrasch played knight to c6, and I think the game is actually about equal at this point, although Tarrasch seems to think that he's already quite a bit better. A move he considers here is queen to a6 check, and after king to g2, knight to d3. And I think he's right to reject this. After queen to b1, white can expel the invaders, and he'll be in reasonable shape. If knight takes b2, then knight to b5 is a good move. Sacrificing a pawn, but here really white stands well. The knight on b5 is very good. Black's bishop has no real employment. The d4 pawn is quite safe and sound, and black's queen is shut out. So I think this is quite reasonable for white, and maybe g4 is coming too. Tarrasch gives bishop to b4 instead, and mentions, of course, knight to b5, and here white is even a little bit better. So, yeah, this knight to d3 idea is not fantastic, but queen to d3 instead, I think, is quite reasonable. White has to play, I think, accurately, not to even just get in trouble. All right, rook takes c3 is threatened, so knight to e1 is a good move, but now it sacrifices a pawn temporarily. And he's got this little trick to get it back. But now the threat is bishop takes e1, followed by entering with the rook. And white's bishop on d4 is really definitely not as good a piece as the black knight on d5. So black is a little bit better here. So I think this queen a6 check and then queen d3 idea is pretty decent. All right, so knight to c6 happened, knight to b5, and now knight a7. So Tarrasch is definitely scrapping to get rid of this black, or this hole he's got on b5. All right, well now, unmentioned by Tarrasch, but a good move is queen to d3. And this, I think, maintains equality. The point being that after knight takes b5, there's queen takes b5, and after queen b5, a b5, the pawn on a5 is a little bit loose. Actually, Yeah, but that's not so good because rook c2 comes with tempo and then b6. So I think after knight b5, probably a takes b5 should be played. And white seems to have enough time to keep things together to be able to play king g2 and then challenge the c file. Instead, Paulsen played knight takes a7. After queen takes a7, now I think white has to play pretty accurately to stay afloat. And I think the best move is g4, driving the knight away before he has problems with the d4 pawn. Okay, black can play either knight h6 or knight to h4. They're both okay, but white is fine either way too. So for instance, knight h6, h3, queen a6, king g2. And here if black plays to double on the c file, I think white could even be a little bit better. So he trades one rook and then plays bishop to c1, aiming at the knight and hoping to play perhaps bishop to g5 to swap off his bad bishop. I think a better approach for black is f5, which randomizes the position a bit. If g5, then the king side is closed, and black is going to be fine there, no problems. And on the other hand, if some kind of exchange takes place, well, whether it's e takes f6 or something else, the white king on g2 can be a little bit exposed. So this is fine for black, but okay, white is okay too. If knight h4, then takes, and king to g2. And while the white king side has some, let's say, mini holes on h4 and f4, the bishop on h4 by itself doesn't do anything really, and the other squares are all inaccessible to black's pieces. So after something like queen to a6, rook e1, rook c7, and then queen f3, white has definite counterplay. So he's got as much right and access to the king side as black does. Okay, so g4 I think was the way to go. Instead, Paulsen played queen to d3, and from here we now see the black strategic idea really come into full flower. Tarrasch plays queen to a6, which is a very good move, and he calls this decisive. So he writes, after the exchange of queens, white cannot prevent the black rook's penetration, and the open b file makes it possible to attack the b2 pawn directly. Should be b3 pawn. So I definitely think black is better here. All right, I mean, there's just no question about that. Decisive is a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly white is already in big trouble. Okay, well, white makes the exchange, and you might think kind of offhandedly that the black a-pawns are weak, but they really aren't. For one thing, okay, the pawn on a6, I mean, there's nothing that white's going to attack it with. The pawn on a5 could be counterattacked on, but black could easily defend it with bishop to b4 or bishop to d8. But more to the point is that the b3 pawn is exposed. And once that's captured, all of the black pieces really start to flood the queen side. So even if there's a trade of the b3 pawn for the a5 pawn, black will simply dominate over there. So it's a perfectly good exchange for black. All right. Here white played king to g2 to get the rook into play as fast as possible. If knight to e1, which has in mind stopping rook to c2, and maybe in some case putting the knight on d3 and even in some dream line on c5, black would play rook to b8. Here white should probably play g4, again trying to sideline the knight before the d4 pawn is up for grabs. Still, after some series of moves like this, white is in terrible trouble. And this is probably winning for black in the not too long run. Okay, instead of g4 here, Tarrasch suggests bishop to c3, and this is of course just an easily winning position. Free pawn, and an absolutely dominating position for black. Okay, so instead of knight to e1, Paulsen played king g2. Okay, rook c2, bishop c1, rook to b8. Rook to b1, rook c3. So the b3 pawn is going to fall, but so is the black a5 pawn. And here we have a good position to stop and think about what to do. Clearly, the white pawns on d4 and a4 are weak. They are going to drop sooner or later. But we want to be a little bit careful about this. And the thing to realize is that these are chronic weaknesses. All right, they're not there for they're going to be problems for a long, long time. So, as I mentioned before, when you've got these long-term advantages, it's often a very good idea to make sure that your opponent can't create any kind of counterplay. So if black were to play rook to a3, just winning this pawn outright, well, the problem is after rook to c1, all of a sudden there's a bit of counter penetration here. Rook to c7 is coming, and if black were to play a move like bishop to d8, well, in that case we swap and play knight to g5, and again there's some counterplay. Okay, so white's got his knight active, the pawns on h7 and f7 are a bit loose, and white doesn't have to worry about a move like king to e7 because then rook c7 becomes a real problem. So this is definitely not the way for black to handle the position. Rook to a3 would just be really a mistake. All right, so instead the right move is rook to b2. This is a good move. So what's the point of this? Well, now if rook to c1, there's knight to e3 check and knight to c4. The knight's on a great square and it plugs up the c file. No more counterplay for white. So Paulsen played bishop to d2, preventing this knight transfer via e3. And again, there's a little trick. If knight takes d4, well, bishop to c3, and black is losing material. So bishop to b4 was a very good move. So this swaps off the bishop, or at least drives it away from its useful square. And notice, of course, that without the white bishop on a5, there's no real threat from rook to c1. So if bishop takes b4, rook takes b4, rook c1 is just no big deal at all. Okay, white plays bishop to f4, trying to avoid this exchange, and also to prevent still this knight e3 c4 idea from ever being a possibility. Well, here black played a very natural move, h6, and maybe this is slightly inaccurate. Tarrasch recommends rook to a2 here instead. The point is that while h6 takes away g5 from the white knight, it allows g4 followed by g5 sooner or later with some prospects for counterplay. So I'm not sure if rook to a2 is better, but it's a reasonable thought. So and it's a very deep idea to not play h6 because of white's subsequent possibilities. Okay, knight to e7, rook a1, knight c6. So the knight is still finding its way very easily to good squares. The d4 pawn is still under pressure, and maybe again knight to a5, c4 could be played in some position if need be. Bishop to c1, rook c2, bishop a3. So now all of a sudden, ironically, white is swapping off this bishop. Okay, well here black probably should have just played bishop a3, and then on rook a3, rook c4. Just collecting the pawn. Rook to b3 is no big deal because of king c7. Anyway, in the game, Tarrasch played rook to c4 straight away. Bishop to b2, and okay, Tarrasch is forced to make this exchange anyway, and we basically come to the same position, except that we could have had it with the rook on c4 instead, which would be a little bit better, but doesn't really change anything. Alright, well now, if rook to a1, black plays a5, fixing the pawn in place, and then after rook c4, the pawn drops. But Paulsen found an interesting way to go for some counterplay. He played g5. And now the question is, well, what should black do here? Should you take? Should you let white take? Should you play h5? What do you do? Well, the natural move would be maybe h5 and then to play g6. But the problem is that if you play h5, white gets g6 in first. And after fg, there's knight to g5. And if knight takes d4, rook to d1 exploits a neat little tactical possibility, which is that on rook to c4, trying to hold everything, there's rook takes d4 and knight e6 check, winning. So after rook to d1, the knight has to move, but then, okay, knight takes e6, and the d5 pawn is dropping, or it's not dropping necessarily, but it's hanging. g7 is hanging, and certainly black has given white all kinds of undeserved counterplay. So Tarrasch correctly, instead of h5, plays the move rook to c4. So he just lines up on the pawns, and after gh, the weakness of h6 is not really very serious. It's going to take white quite a long time to get to that pawn. Alright, a5, and again, it's a bit of a bid for counterplay, although I think here Tarrasch maybe misassesses it. So he rejects knight takes a5. Well, before we get to that, let's talk about knight takes d4. So again, this shows one of the ideas. Knight d4, rook d4, and rook to b6. Again, white has achieved some undeserved counterplay here. This would not be a good idea for black. Okay, Tarrasch rejected knight takes a5 because after rook a1, king b6, rook check, he felt that the king would be badly posted on a7. But I think he's actually mistaken about this. The a-pawn is actually very fast, and the king will help the a-pawn, if need be, in its plot to advance. So the knight and rook can continue to hit at white's weak pawns, especially the one on d4, while the king and a-pawn will form, and again in conjunction with black's other pieces, but also by themselves, will form a powerful duo moving up the board. Nevertheless, Tarrasch's basic idea is quite well motivated, and he plays rook to a4. So this prevents rook to b6, because after rook b6, just rook takes a5, and the rook has to go back out the way it came. And white has nothing here. So he plays king g3. The only thing he can even try to do is to advance the king and go for the h-pawn. All right, rook takes a5, king g4, and now a very good move by Tarrasch. See if you can figure out what it is. Rook a3. So more prophylaxis here. So this king h5 idea is impossible because it would hang the knight. And he can't move the knight because it hangs the d-pawn. So what is he going to do? Well, he plays rook to d1. So he's going to try to free the knight. And so by freeing the knight, he frees the king on its little journey to the h-pawn. But even then, it's really a long way from being serious counterplay. Okay, rook to b3, covering the b-file, preparing to retreat it to b8 if necessary someday, and also clearing the a-file for the pawn, although that could have been done later. Okay, h4. Here I would prefer to just shove the pawn. a5, let's say knight e1, rook to b4, knight c2, rook c4, and if rook to d2, knight takes e5, wins another pawn. So that would have been a very straightforward win. Okay, so knight to e7 is pretty unnecessary, but it's not terrible. Knight e1, knight f5, and lo and behold, the knight is again on a great square, and one where it protects the pawn on h6 and hits the pawn on h4 too. So white's counterplay has gotten nowhere. So for that reason, I think really that his criticism of h6 earlier, preferring rook to a2, was not really so well motivated. I think it's maybe a bit of an overreaction. So not so serious, but still. Anyway, the counterplay was not really such a big deal. But okay, let's get back to the game. After, knight e7, okay, we're here. Right, knight f5, white has to try to find something else active to do. So he plays knight to d3, he wants to put the knight on c5. Well, here if knight takes d4, then white is getting his wish. Knight to c5, and again there are tricks. Hits the rook, hits the knight, and rook to b4 is impossible because of knight takes a6 check. But of course this isn't going to happen. a5. So we just move the pawn up. We avoid any forks with knight to c5, at least that involve the pawn, and maintain the status quo in the center. Again, white's weaknesses are going absolutely nowhere, so there's no reason for black to take any risks at all. Just keep control, and the game will win itself. Knight c5, rook c3. Okay, and the threat here, well, okay, maybe play king c6, and then you can play knight takes d4. But again, no rush. All right, white played rook to b1, going for counterplay. And finally, knight takes d4. Tarrasch says, again, in a bit of good old-fashioned dogmatism, the d-pawn, after having been held for 40 moves, will finally be lost. So 40 moves ago was bishop to d3. Anyway, certainly it's been under pressure for a long time, and finally black is collected. All right, well here rook to b7 check would just be a blunder. King c6, and white is losing a piece. So knight a6 check, king d8, rook to b8 check. Here Tarrasch mentions king e7 and rejects it wrongly. Okay, it's not really important. His move is perfectly good. Rook to c8, rook to b7, king to e8, knight c7 check, king f8. And white's little bid for activity just doesn't get anywhere. So yeah, the black king has been deactivated, and he didn't need necessarily to do that, but the general idea was right. There was a line where he felt that white could maybe get a little bit of counterplay, and since he's up 2 pawns for basically nothing, it's perfectly fine for him to make this small concession to kill any possible counterplay. Okay, well here if king to h5, then knight f5, again protecting the pawn, and counterattacking the h-pawn. And here if knight to b5, trying to play knight to d6 to undermine the defense of the h6 pawn, well, rook to c4 has a lethal mate threat. Rook takes h4 is coming, and it's going to cost white dearly to avoid this. So knight to b5 immediately was played in the game. Takes. And while there's nothing wrong with a4, of course, Tarrasch followed his own rule. Put rooks behind passed pawns, whether yours or your opponent's. So here the rook helps to push the a-pawn along. White should probably jump in front of it as fast as possible, but it's completely hopeless. Black has many good moves here, including the simple f6, creating more potential passed pawns in the center. Okay, and activating his king. Anyway, white played f4, so he has a cute stalemate idea in mind. Okay, it just requires a little bit of accuracy on Tarrasch's part, and he's up to the job, but at least it's cute for the finish. Rook to b1, a3, f5, a2, rook a1, check, king h5, king g6, takes and takes. And here you can see the stalemate nook. If you just eliminated the white rook from the board here and changed nothing else, it would be stalemate. Unfortunately, it's not so easy for white to get rid of the rook in a way that maintains the stalemate. So if rook takes a2, well, rook takes a2, and the white king can retreat to g4. All right, he plays rook to g1 check. Tarrasch plays king to h8. Actually, he could have played king to h7 as well, as long as he doesn't meet rook to g7 check by taking. And well, let's just take a quick look. All right, so king h7, rook g7. Of course, you don't take this. King h8. Now, if rook to g8, you can take it, because then the king has h6 and g6. Now, you can try this, but then you just go here, and now there are no more good rook checks. So if rook to g8 or rook to f7, you could take the rook. So this wins, of course, but it's no big deal. King to h8 is just a little bit simpler, because now in rook to g8 you can take. So he goes back, still hoping for some miracle here. King h7, rook g1, and now he queens. Okay, so there's the try again, king h8, and again we're going to come to the same thing. Rook h7, king g8, rook g7, king f8, and then the rook can be taken next move. So white resigned here. It was clear that black wasn't going to fall for the stalemate. And Tarrasch called this one of his best played games. And indeed, I think it is a very good game. It illustrates beautifully what or how black can win in an advanced French when white just plays, a little bit routinely. I mean, this illustrates one of black's basic fundamental approaches. So you keep the king side more or less closed. You have access to the queen side, and gradually the white d pawn and the other queenside pawns can become a problem. And you can see that black was able to take complete control over the light squares too, and it took a long time, but the many weaknesses that white had on the queen side brought to bear. The fact that white has a dark squared bishop, we saw that piece was of very little value to white as well, because again it did nothing to fight for the light squares. So a nice model game. Tarrasch again definitely overstated the cause for black, or the case for black, but still this is how white can win, or how white can lose, and without making any obvious errors. So it's a very dangerous kind of opening for white strategically. He definitely has to not allow black to let the play be this one-sided, and it's very easy for it to be the case. Louis Paulsen, Tarrasch's opponent in this game, was a great player, and I would say one of the most strategically sophisticated players of the second half of the 19th century. But still, he basically lost without ever really having a chance in this game, and but also again without really making any overt mistakes. Okay, so that's enough about this game and about Tarrasch and his alleged dogmatism. And so I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something about Tarrasch and also about the advanced French defense. Okay, thanks a lot. See you next week. Bye-bye.